Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Westward expansion made the United States a country that stretched across the continent, but it also blew up on old divides and slavery, and it gashed new racial wounds into an American body. We have a wild one today. Stay with us. So, turn us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to identify the major factors contributing to U.S. territorial expansion in the 1840s. You should be able to assess why the United States fought the war with Mexico and evaluate the larger impact of that war. You should be able to explain how westward expansion made slavery a divisive political issue in the 1840s and the 1850s. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Here I want to roll back some of our storyline and pick up something we haven't talked about for a while, and that's Native America. When we talk about westward expansion, we're talking about basically American settlers moving into the Great Plains, and so let's pick up our story with the Plains Indians. As the Pacific-bound wagon trains were stumbling across Nebraska, the migrants encountered the Great Plains. The Great Plains were this vast sea almost of grass from Texas to Saskatchewan, from Texas to Saskatchewan in Canada, and from the Missouri River westward all the way to the Rocky Mountains. This huge swath of land of just what seems like a grassy, almost expansive desert. Nomadic buffalo hunting Indian peoples were roaming the western plains, while the tall grasslands, the river valleys to the east, were home to more sedentary tribes. There was a line of military forts stretching from Fort Jessup in Louisiana to Fort Snelling, then in what was the Wisconsin Territory. And they policed the boundary between what's essentially white America and what Congress in 1834 designated as permanent Indian territory. For centuries, the Indians who lived on the eastern edge of the plains, such as the Pawnees or the Mandans on the upper Missouri, they subsisted primarily on simple food crops, corn and beans, supplemented somewhat with buffalo meat. They also exchanged goods with traders and travelers along the Santa Fe Trail, which cut through the Comanche and the Kiowa territory as it connected Missouri to New Mexico. By the early 1840s, goods worth nearly $1 million were traveling along that trail every year. By the 1830s, the Kiowas, the Cheyennes, the Arapahoes, they had also adopted horse culture. And that horse culture, once allied with the Comanches, dominated the plains between the Arkansas and the Red Rivers. As European horses enhanced the mobility and the wealth of the Plains Indians, European diseases and guns were also thinning their ranks. A devastating smallpox epidemic spread northward from New Spain in 1779 to 1781, and it ended up killing about half of the Plains peoples. European weapons also altered the relationship between Native American peoples, allowing, for instance, the Blackfeet to drive the Shoshones and Crows southward. The powerful Sioux tribes, who acquired guns and ammunition from the French and the Spanish and the American traders along the Missouri River, they also remained as buffalo hunters. As nomadic people who lived in small groups, the Sioux largely avoided the major epidemics and increased in their numbers, while other tribes were decreasing in numbers. Buffalo hunting evolved into a full-blown business for many Indians as they traded surplus hides and dried meats for pots and knives and guns and other Euro-American manufactured goods. Few Native American peoples began to realize that increasing the size of their kill also diminished the size of the buffalo herds and consequently would bring an untimely end to the Plains Indians. Subpoint B. Here, let's turn our eyes southward down towards Texas, and which, when we're picking up the storyline, is actually part of kind of the New Spain area of Mexico. The first part of Mexico to be settled by any significant numbers of Americans was the Texas region. And in 1820, the Spanish made an agreement with a person named Moses Austin. Moses Austin was a farmer from Connecticut, but made this deal to move to Texas and then go develop that land. Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, the same year that Moses Austin died, and his son, Stephen F. Austin, took over his father's land grant in that new country. Stephen F. Austin convinced over 300 American settler families to move to that Texas region of Mexico. Throughout the 1820s, Austin sought to maintain good relations with the Mexican government. He even helped go so far as to suppress the Fredonian Rebellion. That was an attempted independence movement. Austin also helped ensure the introduction of slavery into Texas. Despite the attempts of Mexican government to ban the institution, Mexico had banned slavery, but local authorities allowed the settlers to bring in their slaves anyway. And alarmed that their grip on the area was weakening, the Mexican government in 1830 annulled all of the land contracts and barred future immigration from the United States. So all of those previous land grants that like Moses Austin would have set up and Stephen F. Austin was holding over basically says, no, in flagrant violation of the slavery laws, we're stripping you of this land. As Texas settlers became increasingly dissatisfied with this tougher-fisted Mexican government, Austin advocated conciliation. Let's find some places where we can give up and stay in place. But the dissent against Mexico escalated eventually in the 1835 Texas Revolution. There, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sent an army in 1835 to go impose that Mexican authority, while rebels formed a provisional government, soon calling for Texas independence. So Mexico is trying to assert stronger control over the Texas region, and the Americans in Texas say, this is bad, and they set up like a brand new government to rival and declare independence from there. In February of 1836, Santa Anna stormed the Alamo. The Alamo was a mission outpost, and there he killed 187 American and Tejano defenders. Sam Houston's army went and routed through Santa Anna's army at San Jacinto, and that victory secured Texas independence. Houston then was named governor of the new Republic of Texas. In 1837, Texas went and asked for annexation into the United States, but neither Andrew Jackson nor Martin Van Buren acted on that because they were worried about the political ramifications of adding another slave state. And that brings us to the election of 1844. The issue of Texas annexation, being linked to slavery, had a strong effect on the American presidential nominations. Take, for instance, Henry Clay, whom we've met a few times so far in this class. Henry Clay was the nominee of the Whig Party, and he championed, like Henry Clay is going to do, the American system of internal improvements and high tariffs and a national banking model, and begrudgingly supported the annexation of Texas, although he didn't really want to make it a campaign issue. On the other hand, in 1844 is Martin Van Buren, the Democrat / former president / presumptive presidential nominee, who also wanted to keep Texas out of the presidential campaign. But there's a third person in this race, and it's James K. Polk. Polk was a Tennessee slaveholder and a friend of Andrew Jackson. He received the Democratic nomination instead of Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, who in a lot of ways created the Democratic Party, doesn't get nominated by that Democratic Party to go run for president. Instead, they named James K. Polk. Here, Polk openly supported Texas annexation and reoccupation of all of Oregon. You could argue about what reoccupation is all day, but he wants to reoccupy Oregon all the way up to the 40-degree latitude line and to take it away from what was British control. James K. Polk is often referred to as the dark horse candidate. He's the one that nobody saw coming, and he defeated Clay in a close election. Immediately after his victory, Democrats in Congress then swoop in to go fulfill the campaign promise and approve Texas annexation and brought it into the Union just before Polk took office in 1845. Polk, when he took office, basically had four pretty clearly stated goals as well. He wanted to reduce tariffs. He wanted to reestablish an independent treasury system. He wanted to settle this issue about Oregon, and he wanted to bring California into the Union. So let's turn then in subpoint D to discuss Oregon itself. The Oregon country stretched along the Pacific coast border, a long way with Mexican California to the border to Russian Alaska. So basically California belongs to Mexico, and this Oregon territory is everything above California and below Alaska. So everything that's not Mexico or Russia, that's sort of the Oregon territory. And both Great Britain and the United States had competing claims to the area. Oregon fever raged in 1843 as thousands of people, lured by the reports of fine harbors and a mild climate and fertile soil, they journeyed for months across the continent to the Willamette Valley. In 1860, about 250,000 Americans had braved the Oregon Trail. Many died en route from disease and exposure, although relatively few died from Indian attacks. Some pioneers left the Oregon Trail and traveled south along the California Trail, and there they settled along the Sacramento River in the Mexican province of California. Resolving Oregon by compromise was actually pretty easy, and Polk picks up the Oregon line a little south of his promise of 40, but still settles the territory. Subpoint E. California is a different kettle of fish, though. California was mostly an uninhabited country with a few Catholic mission outposts. While it technically belonged to Mexico, it was mostly empty country without a lot of settlers there. To promote that development of the territory, Mexican government took over the California missions, basically stripping them from church control and putting them under government control. There they liberated the 20,000 Indians who worked on them, many of whom had intermarried with mestizos and worked as laborers and cowboys on large cattle ranches. The rise of cattle ranching changed a new society in California. It also changed the economy as agents from New England firms assimilated into Mexican life and married into the families, the Californos. Many American immigrants in California, they really had no desire, though, to assimilate into Mexican society. And they hoped for eventual annexation into the United States. But the reality was that there was too few American settlers to make that dream, a viable thing. By 1840, though, California was linked to the United States. And California is not part of the United States in 1840, but it becomes linked to the United States through trade. Trading animal skins and other products with New England by sailing all the way south and down around South America. There's no Panama Canal yet, so it travels by boat a long way, but effectively getting there. Acquiring California was a tougher task for Polk than it was to acquire Oregon. And Polk ended up starting a war with Mexico to claim the territory, starting in the disputed border areas of Texas. And that takes us to Roman numeral number 2. We'll start with the war with Mexico, a war that took place between 1846 and 1848. In 1845, John L. O'Sullivan coined the phrase manifest destiny, and he believed that Americans had the right to develop the entire continent as they saw fit, implying this cultural and racial superiority. By the end of 1846, the United States really did control much of northeastern Mexico. Although most Americans, inspired by Manifest Destiny, supported a war with Mexico, a vocal minority feared that really the only aim of this was to go steal some land and to expand slavery. President Polk saw Texas as just the beginning. He wanted the United States to control all of the Mexican territory between Texas and the Pacific Ocean, and he was prepared to go to war to get it. Mexico was determined, though, to retain its territories, and when the Texas Republic accepted American statehood in 1845, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. The actual combat for taking California took place really on 3 fronts. On one sense, you have the fighting in California. It's what's known as the Bear Flag Rebellion, or the start of the Bear Flag Republic. And it was led by John C. Fremont. Remember that name, John C. Fremont, to go declare independence in California. And the plan was, so fight a rebellion in California, declare independence, have a country of California, and then immediately apply for annexation to the United States. So that's one front of the war, the Bear Flag Rebellion in California. The second front would be in Santa Fe, in what's modern-day New Mexico. There, General Stephen Kearny would occupy the capital city with 1,600 troops. Most of the fighting in the Mexican War, though, was led by General Winfield Scott, another name you'll want to hang on to. Winfield Scott sailed to Veracruz before marching into central Mexico, and there they tried to occupy the capital and force a treaty. Polk, hoping to inspire a revolution in California, would lead, hoping that if he inspires a revolution, and then it would lead to American incorporation. He ordered Navy commanders to go seize coastal towns in case of a war. And then he dispatched John C. Fremont's heavily armed troops deep into the Mexican territory to go declare this brand new Bear Flag Republic. Polk also sent John Slidell to Mexico on a secret diplomatic initiative to go secure the Mexican acceptance of the Rio Grande territory. There, as soon as they go down and convince the Mexicans to allow the Rio Grande to be sort of the borderline from there, and then they would go and buy New Mexico and California. However, Mexican officials refused to see John Slidell, and so that came off the table. To intimidate the Mexican government, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor, boy, there's so many names in here worth remembering, ordered General Zachary Taylor to go occupy the disputed lands between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. When a clash inevitably occurred, Polk blamed the Mexicans for the bloodshed and called for a war. Ignoring Whig pleas for a negotiated settlement, the Democratic majority in Congress voted for go to war against Mexico. Subpoint B. The American military experienced a few important successes as early in the Mexican War. Naval attacks, a staged revolt by Fremont's unit, and army reinforcements allowed American forces basically to go seize control of California in 1847. Santa Anna then went on the offensive, attacking General Zachary Taylor's units at Buena Vista in 1847, and the only superior artillery was that to allow a narrow American victory. So Americans end up winning over Santa Anna, just got a little better artillery, superior artillery fire. But otherwise, they're way outmatched by Santa Anna. General Winfield Scott, when he seized Mexico City in 1847, he marches all the way into the interior of the country and takes the capital. Santa Anna then was overthrown, and a brand new Mexican government was established, and that brand new Mexican government immediately tries to secure peace with the United States. Subpoint C. Mexicans still see this war with America as one of the central events in their history and a source of much resentment between the two countries. A region, northern Mexico, a region that had for centuries been united, was suddenly split into two, and it divided families and severed trade routes. Men then were guaranteed American rights, while Indians were described as simply savage tribes that had no claims on liberty. Mexico had abolished slavery, and they had declared all persons to be equal before the law. But this new Texas Constitution, adopted after independence, not only included protections for slavery, but denied the rights to Indians and any person of African origin. Roman numeral number 3. Here, let's focus a bit more on California, but also enter into the story my favorite state, that of Kansas. Subpoint A. A number of Whigs considered themselves conscious Whigs, and they viewed the Mexican War basically through the eyes of, like, this is the Democratic Party trying to expand slavery and take land that has no right to them, adding new slaves to the West. Voters seemed to agree in that in 1846, and they gave the Whigs control of Congress to go rein in those Democratic voters. Polk's expansionist policy split the Democrats into sectional factions, and in 1846, Congressman David Wilmot proposed a resolution prohibiting slavery from any of the territory acquired from Mexico. Even though Wilmot is a Democrat, he doesn't want to see the expansion of slavery. So in a way, Wilmot's kind of breaking ranks on this one. And the Senate saw what he was doing and rejected the Wilmot proviso. To reunite Democrats, though, before the election, the Polk and Buchanan essentially abandoned their expansionist approaches for Mexico, and they agreed to only take California and New Mexico and not go further into Mexican territory. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for 1 million square miles of territory north of the Rio Grande. That included present-day Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. The establishment of the Oregon Territory and the acquisition of New Mexico and California in 1848 seemed to have fulfilled the promises of Manifest Destiny. And then let's spend a little time in 1848 with our subpoint B. Because in 1848, Polk declined to run for re-election. He was in declining health and basically met his 4 goals for office. You remember his 4 goals for office included reducing tariffs, which he had done, reestablishing the independent treasury, which he had done, settling the Oregon dispute, triple check, and bringing California into the Union, which it's on the way to, which had been done. And basically, the Bear Flag Rebellion was safe. So basically, in 1848, he just decides, I have met all of my goals, and declines to go run again for office. I have lost my spot in the page. There it is, in 1844. The issue, nope, not in 1844. We're past that one. We are in Roman numeral number 3, subpoint B, 1848. In 1848, Polk declined to go run for office again. He was in declining health and he met all of his goals. Democrats nominated Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan as their presidential candidate for the 1848 election. Cass was an avid expansionist, and he proposed squatter sovereignty, basically saying, like, if nobody's in this territory and white people move into it, they can go establish squatters' rights and go take over the land. Which allowed settlers in each territory, and then, once establishing there, let them determine whether that status would be free or slave territory. Opponents of slavery's expansion organized a new political party known as the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party nominated our old friend Martin Van Buren for the presidency. Now, Martin Van Buren had been a Democrat. He had one of the founders of the Democratic Party. He'd been a Democratic president. He had tried to get the Democratic nomination in 1844 and didn't. And in 1848, he basically says, well, I don't no longer trust the Democrats. I'm going to go split and join this Free Soil Party. And that's who they nominate for president as well. By this point, MVB he just hated the Democratic nominee, Lewis Cass, and ran against him, knowing full well that when he did so, he would split the Democratic Party votes. There would be people that would be Van Buren voters and people that would be Cass voters, and he would split the Democratic Party. But he knew he was going to do it anyway. And that would basically hand the Whig candidate the win. The Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor, who we met earlier in this episode as the general of the Mexican War. They nominated Zachary Taylor, who was a war hero. Here, the Whigs also nominate a slaveholder, and he won election. 1848 was a crazy year. It was a year of revolution in Europe. The British were demanding democratic reforms. The French were establishing their second republic, having thrown a French Revolution and failed and put in the king, and now they're overthrowing that king for the second revolution. Hungary had been seceding from Austria, and patriot movements in Italy and to Germany, most of which were counter-suppressed by an anti-patriotic movement of reestablishing control. Americans are also looking in 1848 that maybe our own experiment in self-government was failing. There's something about Americans that we're proud of our country, but we're always kind of ready for it to crumble. And in 1848, Americans worried that our own experiment in self-government would fail. Zachary Taylor and his running mate Millard Fillmore won that election, but the electoral margin was very thin because the Free Soil ticket ended up taking New York's vote, splitting apart the Democratic Party. Subpoint C. In January of 1848, even before Zachary Taylor took office, workers for John Sutter in the Sierra foothills of California make a striking discovery that would change the way the West would be seen. There, they discovered flakes of gold. By January of 1949, 61 crowded ships left ports in America's northeast and crossed all the way down under South America, under the Cape Horn, to San Francisco. By May, 12,000 wagons were crossing the Missouri River, bound for the gold fields of California. By the end of 1949, more than 80,000 people, mostly men, the so-called 49ers, had arrived in California. Few miners honestly became rich. Most of them didn't make it. They faced disease and death, and many returned home absolutely penniless. Most miners eventually found themselves not striking gold and getting rich, but working for wages for companies that engaged in hydraulic or underground mining. Many of them just turned to farming and gave up the hopes for mining from there. Subpoint D, the non-Indian population of California in 1848 was fewer than 15,000 people. So there's a fair amount of Native Americans living in California in 1848, but non-Indians, fewer than 15,000. But by 1860, just a mere 12 years later, that 15,000 had turned into 360,000. California's gold rush population was incredibly diverse, with miners from Mexico and South America and white non-miners from Europe and America. Also included were thousands of Chinese workers under labor contracts with Chinese merchants. But then once they arrived, they signed their contracts in China, come here to go work for a Chinese mining company. But as soon as they get here, they sell those contracts, or those contracts are sold to U.S. mines and railroad companies. And it's not quite slave labor, but they're kind of treated like slave labor. American miners treated alien whites fairly. If you're a white person who had come to California, then the Americans there treated the person pretty fairly. But Indians and Mexicans and Chilean access to the gold fields were pretty strictly limited. They even called for new laws to go expel Chinese miners from prospecting areas, while thousands of Indian children were just declared to be plain old orphans. And then once they were orphans, they were chattel of the state, and they were bought and sold more or less as slaves. Farming required any kind of farmable land. You need to have arable land, and any of the arable land was owned by Mexican grantees or occupied by Indians. So in 1848, there was 150,000 Native Americans in California. It's almost like the numbers flip with white settlers. By 1861, there was 30,000. European diseases took the lives of most of those natives, but in California, white settlers also took a systematic plan of extermination. Their local political leaders did very little to stop them. Well, Congress abetted these assaults by repudiating the treaties that the federal agents had negotiated with 119 tribes and provided Indians with 7 million acres of land. So Congress tried to fix these problems by making greater treaties and offering land. But by 1853, Congress then reneged on those and authorizes 5 reservations of 25,000 acres each, and then refused to provide Indians with any military protection, basically saying, stay here, and if somebody attacks you, you're on your own, bucko. Some settlers simply murdered the Indians to go push them off any non-reservation lands, and other white Californians just turned to slave trading. Subpoint E. The Mexicans and the Californios who held grants to thousands of acres were harder to dislodge. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that Spanish and Mexican land grants would be inviolably respected. Although many of the 800 grants in California, the reality was about 800, of those 800, there were a lot of them that were just plain old fraudulent documents or legally questionable. The Land Claims Commission created by Congress upheld the validity of at least 75% of them. In the meantime, hundreds of American squatters, rejecting the notion that so much unoccupied land and so much unimproved land, how could it be held by so few families? They basically set up farms on the land grants which were supposed to be protected. There, they successfully pressured local land commissioners and judges to void any of the suspect land grants and encouraged the landowners that had there to go sell their lands at bargain prices. In Northern California, farmers found that they could easily grow most eastern crops. If you could grow it in the east, in Northern California, it would grow there pretty well too. Ranchers gradually replaced Spanish cattle with American breeds, and there they found a ready market as California's population was shooting up to 380,000 and even north of 500,000 by 560,000 by 1870. Wheat and barley farmers were cultivating crops with hundreds of acres of farming fields, using the latest technology and scores of these hired workers to go produce crops, which San Francisco merchants would export to Europe at high prices. The gold rush eventually turned into a wheat rush, and it was an agricultural boom. Subpoint F. The California Gold Rush and the subsequent influx of settlers revived a national debate over free soil and what should the future of slavery be in the country. In November of 1949, Californians ratified a brand new state constitution that prohibited slavery. John C. Calhoun warned of possible secession by slave states and advanced the doctrine that Congress had no constitutional authority to regulate slavery in these territories. Many Southerners and many Northern Democrats were willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific, guaranteeing slave owners access to that western territory. A third choice, the squatters' rights, the popular sovereignty, called popular sovereignty because it basically means the people, the populace will go decide for themselves. That idea was that decisions about slavery should be placed in the hands of local settlers and in the territorial governments. So in 1850 you have these arguments. Should we expand slavery? Should the slavery line continue all the way through the territories? Does Congress have the right to regulate slavery in the territories? Should just the people there decide it for themselves? Anti-slavery advocates were unwilling to accept any plan for California that might involve the expansion of slavery into the territories. And they urged federal authorities to go restrict slavery within the existing boundaries and eventually to just go extinguish it altogether. When the slavery issue was appearing more and more ominous, Whigs and Democrats sought a compromise to preserve the Union and hold it all together. They organized the Compromise of 1850, a catchy name. The Compromise of 1850 helped to resolve the differences between the sections. This plan included, first, the admission of California as a free state, the abolition of the slave trade, but not slavery. So slavery would exist, but no longer buying and selling, in the District of Columbia. There, that would satisfy demands of the North. A new Fugitive Slave Act would mollify the South, so if a slave escaped into free territory, the southern slave owner had the right to go reclaim that slave. Just being in the North doesn't make a person free. And organizing any of the rest of the lands acquired from Mexico into new territories, the territories of New Mexico and Utah, and then letting those territories decide for themselves if they're going to be slave or free, using popular sovereignty as its method. Powerful leaders spoke for and against the compromise. Speaking for the compromise included Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was one of the great orators and great debaters and just great arguers of the day who had a clear-minded approach, and he said that the Compromise of 1850, it's not perfect, it's always a compromise, but it's a great way of trying to settle the West. On the other hand, You have other people that we've met before. John C. Calhoun was against the compromise because he thought that it took away too much slave territory. You also have William Seward, who's going to be important to us soon, who's also against the compromise. What it does do is it averts a secession crisis in 1850, but it resulted in all of these special conventions in the South. In exchange for support for the compromise, the moderate Southern politicians agreed to support any secession in the future. If Congress was out abolishing slavery anywhere else or refusing to grant statehood to a territory that wanted slavery, then the South would go threaten to secede. So basically, let me get this sentence right. Moderate Southern politicians agreed to support secession in the future if Congress abolished slavery anywhere or refused to grant statehood to a territory with a pro-slavery constitution. So if that state goes and decides for itself that it wants to be a slave state, and Congress says, well, we don't want any more slave states, then the Southerners are basically saying that that's their trigger, that they're going to go secede. President Zachary Taylor, who was against the Compromise of 1850, he died in office. And when he died, his vice president, Millard Fillmore, took control, and Millard Fillmore was pro-compromise and secured its passage. Subpoint G, that Fugitive Slave Act, which we talked about just a moment ago, that Fugitive Slave Act allowed for special federal commissioners to determine any of the fate of anybody who was an alleged fugitive from slavery. So if a slave escaped to the north, they would just try to go live as a free person and go pass themselves as a free person. But that also means that even like free people have a chance, like legitimate free people have a chance to go be accused of being an enslaved slave. And then if a person is accused, they don't have the right to a jury trial. They don't even have the right to go testify in a trial by the accused individual. In a series of dramatic confrontations, fugitives, aided by abolitionist allies, violently resisted capture. The law also led to several thousand northern black people to just leave the country altogether rather than go be claimed as an unrightful slave, to just go flee to safety in Canada. Subpoint H. In 1852, it's a presidential year and Franklin Pierce wins office. He's a product of a unified Democratic Party. So Franklin Pierce wins office because the Democratic Party is no longer being split, and a Whig Party who seems to be splitting themselves. The Whigs had no coherent answer for what to do about slavery, and so basically when you had pro-slavery Whigs and anti-slavery Whigs, and more or less the Democrats are all pro-slavery, and so it looks like the Whig Party is unreliable on this question. So if you were a pro-slavery voter, you would really say, like, I don't know if I could trust the Whigs, and they became Democratic voters, and that's how Franklin Pierce wins office. Stephen A. Douglas, a United States Senator, introduced a bill to establish new territorial governments in Nebraska and Kansas, and he basically says we want these two states to be new territories to be organized into states, because then once they have states, it'll be much easier to run a transcontinental railroad through them. Slavery, he said, would be settled by popular sovereignty. Let the Kansans and let the Nebraskans vote on it. Territorial voters then, not Congress, would decide. Under the Missouri Compromise, slavery had been prohibited in anything that would be the Kansas and Nebraska territory. That's all above that line that had been established by the Missouri Compromise. But suddenly, when Stephen A. Douglas proposes this bill that threatens the expansion of slavery, through Douglas's leadership, though, the Kansas-Nebraska bill became law, but it broke Democratic Party unity. The Whig Party collapsed altogether. The South became solidly Democratic, and the Republican Party, a brand new political party, emerges in the North. And there the Republican Party has a clear answer on slavery. They're against it. Further expansion of the territory in the West was adding to the intensity of this debate, such as the 1845 Gadsden Purchase of about 30,000 more or less square miles of land in what's present-day Arizona and New Mexico, purchased from Mexico to build a transcontinental railroad, but increasing, like, what's the southern expansion and what's the western expansion, and how is slavery going to come down on this? This is the simmering kettle, which is about to explode, and a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.